which I will momentarily, I want to also remind you that this morning is Tu B'Shvat, which is the new year of the trees, having to do with the agricultural cycle and the crops and Orla in particular. But let's just call it the new year for the trees right now. We're not going to get, I was about to say, we're not going to get into the weeds of the trees for Tu B'Shvat, especially since trees don't have weeds. However, I do want to say a word about trees in Jewish teaching and history, and in particular, the fact that in the Garden of Eden, there are two trees, right? There's Eitz Chaim, the tree of life, and Eitz Da'at Tov V'Ra, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And if you recall, Adam and Eve, or first Eve, then Adam, because she was the more enterprising of the two, eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And it is interesting to think about the fact that when given a choice between two different trees to eat from, that the first choice that human beings make is not life, but knowledge. I think that says something about us, about our insatiable curiosity to know. And that's a beautiful legacy that we leave to one another, the increase of knowledge throughout the generations, which is in some ways indicative of the increase of life. So let us now go to Bishalach on this Tu B'Shvat. And I want to highlight really two or three themes from the Torah portion to discuss this morning. The first that I want to make clear is the phrase that you find in chapter 14, verse 15. Chapter 14, verse 15. And this is in the book of Exodus. For those of you who are following along the book of Exodus, we're in chapter 14, verse 15. What you find there is that the Israelites have come to the sea, and they're, of course, terrified because they're the Israelites and they're always scared. So it says, Vayomer Hashem Moshe, God says to Moses, Ma titzak alai. Why are you screaming to me? God here in the role of a parent. It's like, why are you yelling at me? Daber el bnei Yisrael v'yisa'u. Speak to the children of Israel and go forward. Now, I want to make one or 2 points about this, this thought that God expresses to Moses. Because ma titzak alai, why are you yelling at me, is in the first case and most obvious case, God making it clear that it is the human responsibility to carry out this escape, as it were, that they have to move. It's not entirely on God. God is not going to actually push them, even though I will come back to that God pushing them in a moment. But here, it's one of those cases where the responsibility is clearly on the children of Israel to take some initiative. It's like that very old joke about the guy in a flood who is sitting on his roof and a boat comes by and says, come on, get on the boat. And he goes, no, God will save me. And another boat comes by and says, quick, get on the boat. He goes, no, God will save me. And then a helicopter comes by and says, climb up. And he goes, no, I'm sure God will save me. And he drowns. He comes up before God in heaven and he says, I don't understand. I had such faith in you. Why didn't you save me? And God says, what do you want from me? I sent you 2 boats and a helicopter. And it's the same idea here. It's like God can only do so much. You now have to walk forward. However, as you know, those of you who watch this Torah class, since you're a very exclusive bunch and highly educated and intuitive, As you know, in Jewish history, our power was sometimes severely limited. So what you get is a fascinating interpretation of this verse by Rashi, the great medieval commentator, right? Lived in the 11th century, 1040, 1105. Rashi says there should be a comma after titzak, ma titzak, or even a question mark. Ma titzak, why are you crying out? Alai, it's on me. In other words, as far as Rashi is concerned, what God is saying is the exact opposite of what we would assume the verse to be saying. Instead of the verse saying, why are you crying out to me? Rashi reads it as, why are you crying out? It's on me. In other words, I will take care of you. Because you can imagine in Rashi's day that it was very hard to understand the God saying to human beings, take your own initiative, since there was so limited and constricted in the initiatives that they could actually take. This says something very powerful about Jewish history and the different conditions that people find themselves in Jewish history. It's like, it's good to pray. It's better to get the vaccine. And best of all is to do both. So it's not only you should cry out to me, but also you should walk forward. And there's something very powerful about that. And so that verse alone, I think, is worth the price of admission. And then what happens is that following that, Moses is told to hold his hand out. Now, Moses' hands, which form a theme actually in this parsha, are an echo of God's hands. Remember that God brings the children of Israel out of Egypt, biyad chazaka uvizroa netuya, with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. So the mighty hand, according to the Kli Yakar, is to bring them out. The outstretched arm is to make sure they stay there, because the impulse to go back to Egypt is very strong. People want to return to things that they remember that were secure, even if they were bad. People have a nostalgia for a home sometimes, even if it was a bad home. People forget the pain of the past and remember with a certain sort of nimbus, a certain halo of positivity what the past was about. And so in Egypt, they at least had the security of slavery. And here you get into the great psychoanalyst Eric Fromm's book, Escape from Freedom, that people want to get out of the possibility of being free. And if you can find them, they'll be okay. And that's one of the reasons why totalitarian governments throughout history have been so successful, because there is a deep need for people to have security, even at the cost of their freedom. So God's hand presages Moses' hands. And Moses' hands here are, in Biyad Chazaka Vizroa Netuya, are not a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, which also, by the way, could be conceived of as, the part that pushes and the part that holds. The outstretched arm could also be seen as God's own offer of security. Instead, Moses stretches his hand out over the sea. And the theme of hands is a very powerful one, yadayim. Later on, we'll find that when Moses holds his hands up, the Israelites win the war against Amalek, and when Moses lets his hands down, they start to lose the war. And we know holding hands, letting go, the metaphor of hands is very, very powerful in the Jewish tradition. When you read the Torah, you use a yad, you use a hand, which is a long, usually silver pointer or marker. And so the idea of the power and security of God's hands, transferring to the power and security of Moses's hands, and then on to all the children of Israel, is something that touches us again and again when we wake up in the morning. It's part of the ritual routine to wash one's hands, to put tefillin on, and part of it covers your hand. It goes on and on, this multiplicity of hand references throughout this story and also throughout Jewish tradition. I want to introduce now a third theme, and this one is also the subject of my Jerusalem Post Torah column this week. And by the way, I just want to announce that some of the themes will be the same, but I've started a Thursday evening Torah class on an app called Clubhouse. So if you join and follow me, you can come to the Torah class. You have to be invited, but there are a lot of people on Clubhouse already. It's on only with an iPhone, I'm afraid. They haven't expanded it to other kinds of phones, but they will. And Clubhouse, what is nice about Clubhouse is you can see who else is in the room easily, but no, it's not Zoom. You don't see people's faces. You just see their icons or whatever. And it's just a listening app. It's not, you don't have to sit fixed in front of a screen. So you can listen to the class, and it's worth checking out. There are a lot of clubs and other things. So far, it seems like a very useful and helpful app if you're interested in it. So in any case, and in the Jerusalem Post column, and partly tonight, I'm going to talk about the theme of what Moses is doing while everybody else is busy collecting the wealth of Egypt. Because remember, as the Israelites are leaving Egypt, they are taking the wages of slavery with them because of the many years that they have been subjected to labor without any compensation. But Moses doesn't do that. Moses, in fact, goes and finds the bones of Joseph, because Joseph, many years before, had said to his brothers as he was dying, "Promise me that you will, when God liberates us from this land, promise me that you will take my bones up and bring me back to the land of Israel, to the promised land." And the brothers promise. And they promise not only for themselves, but for all the generations that follow them. Because remember, it's not helpful if they promise and then of course, they're going to die long before slavery is over. Instead, they must intergenerationally promise that I and my children and my children's children and my children's children's children, on and on, will keep this promise. And then after this rolling generational promise comes to the point of liberation, when God has then reached down to scoop up the Israelites and bring them out of the land, who preoccupies himself with the bones of Joseph? The greatest leader of Israel. Moses takes it upon himself to find Joseph's bones, and I'll talk about that in just a second. And he ensures that they are carried out of Egypt and to Israel. And this is a very powerful model for the idea that this intergenerational memory must sustain us through time, so that we too have something to carry. And we carry the bones, metaphorically, obviously, of our ancestors with us through time. We reenact the rituals that they enacted. We repeat the insights that they offered. We are a consequence of their life choices, right? Why do I live in America? Not because one day I decided, oh, I go to America, as some of you did. No, for me, I live in America because my great grandparents decided to move here. And for those of you who came here in this generation, your grandchildren will live in America because of your choices. And whether they, and your great grandchildren and your great great grandchildren, and whether they know it or not, whether they're not, they'll know it, but whether they consciously acknowledge and feel thankful for it or not, this woman, for example, in my case, one of my great grandparents was alive when I was a child, and she lived probably into my teens and maybe even into my early 20s. Her name was Rachel. I had three bubbies, three grandmothers. One was Sarah, one was Sally, because her name was also Sarah, so we called her Sally. And then my great grandmother was Rachel. She only spoke Yiddish. And she was, I mean, and as I got older, she started to sort of, she was sort of removed, more increasingly removed from this world. And I remember I used to look at her and realize we can't entirely communicate. But I know, and she knows, that the only reason that I am visiting her in Boston, Massachusetts, which is where she lived, I lived in Harrisburg and then Philadelphia, is because she and her husband decided at the, long before the war, that they were going to come to America. And because they did, she could look at her American great grandchildren. And even though they spoke English and she only spoke Yiddish and probably some Russian, she knew that their lives were determined by her decisions. And so Moses carrying the bones of Joseph is a deeply powerful and symbolic and important statement about the way in which the Jewish tradition, and in fact, all human traditions, get passed on one to another, to another, to another throughout the generations. We are the products of decisions that were made by people whom we will never meet. And that's remarkable. So I saw somebody ask when Clubhouse is. It's tonight at 6 o'clock. I'm going to do it every Thursday night at 6 o'clock. That notion of the transfer of tradition is essential to the Jewish tradition. And I want to just mention one other part of this that is particularly, I think, beautiful. And that is that there is only one name mentioned among the Israelites who go down to Egypt, who is also mentioned among the Israelites who come up from Egypt. And that name is Serach bat Asher. And therefore, the rabbis write this beautiful story about how Moses didn't know where Joseph's bones were. I mean, hundreds of years, who knows anymore where Joseph is buried. And so the only person who kept the memory alive of where Joseph was this Serach bat Asher. And she was the living embodiment of Jewish memory and human memory among Israel. And so she's the one who tells Moses where to go. Then there's this other midrash about that his coffin was actually the bottom of the Nile and Moses had to magically bring it up. And I'm not going to go into all that at the moment. But the point is that Serach is the one who is the repository of memory. And this notion that women carried the memory, the collective memory of the Jewish people, is encapsulated in that story about Serach bat Asher. She knew where Joseph was. And even if everybody else didn't know where Joseph was, she wouldn't forget. And in this sense, to bring it sort of full circle before I take any questions, in this sense, it is very much like Tu B'Shvat. because Tu B'Shvat, the planting of the tree, remember the beautiful midrash about the guy who sees an old man planting a tree, and he says, "Why are you planting that tree?" He says, "By the time it bears fruit, you'll be dead." And he says, "Well, when I came into the world, there were all these trees that my ancestors had planted for me, and so I'm planting for those who will come after me." That passing on of tradition, that insistence that what you have must be preserved and given to those who come after you, that is the essence of this story of Moses carrying Joseph's bones. And in some ways is the essence of the Jewish tradition, that which we have must be passed on. Vishinantim levanecha, you should teach your children, v'dibarta, and speak of it. And that idea is the only thing that can preserve generation to generation to generation. Because remember, things that are preserved in books only live if you open up the book and read it. So if there isn't this living transmission, it's dead on a page. In the same way that Latin exists on a page, but there are no communities that speak the language in the world. But Hebrew exists in the world, exists as a language with which people communicate to one another. And so it's a different thing when you wrap an idea up in a person than when you leave it just to be discovered as an intellectual curiosity. All right, let me take some questions and comments. Jim, which direction is God's hand pointing? Is he reaching out to draw the Hebrews from Egypt or reaching forward to keep them from going back? I'm going to say both. How about that? He's reaching out to bring them, and then once they're out, a hand behind them to hold them back. That's only according to the interpretation of the Kli Yakar. Others would say differently, but I think the notion is that God, first of all, obviously, this is all metaphorical, right? In the Hebrew Bible, God doesn't have hands the way we have hands, but the notion is that God brings the Israelites out and somehow ensures that they do not return. So I would say that. Is she Sarah, who is the mother who converted to Judaism? So no, it's Serach bat Asher. The woman who is the mother of converts is Sarah, the wife of Abraham. Different personality. All those who convert to Judaism are considered the children of Abraham and Sarah. And the reason that is so is because Abraham and Sarah were the first. It says, Et hanefashot asher asu b'Charan, the souls that they made in Haran. And that means the people whom they brought under the wings of the Shekhinah, under God's wing. In other words, they brought them from paganism into Judaism. So that's Sarah, different Sarah Imenu, Sarah our mother. And then Misha asks, how could no one have known where Joseph was buried? Well, they could have known for a generation. But boy, you try to find a grave of 400 years ago, it's not easy, even if that person was important in the time. And also, according to the rabbis, Joseph's grave was not a magnificent tomb because the Israelites were afraid that it would be desecrated when the Egyptians turned on them, and therefore was hidden. Now, the midrash is that it was hidden at the bottom of the Nile. And there's a long history to that midrash, which we can go into perhaps another time. James Kuhl writes a lot about it that has to do with exactly the way it's phrased in the Torah. But nonetheless, the point is that it was a deliberate hiding of Joseph's grave, but also, I must say, not so easy in a nation, especially in an ancient time, I'm sure, when you didn't have quite the stability and upkeep that you have of places today. But even today, to preserve such graves, there are a lot of famous figures in history, like Alexander the Great. We don't know where they're buried. Shelley's famous poem about Ozymandias, that he has a traveler who's going into the desert, and he sees an inscription that says, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." And he looks around and it says, "The lone and level sands stretch far away." In other words, Ozymandias built this gigantic city, thought it would be seen forever and ever. And there's this traveler who only sees the inscription, but nothing else remains. So we sometimes underestimate the extent to which time can devastate even things that we think of as permanent. We just forget how impermanent they are because we're not there anymore when the things we think are forever are no longer forever. And we also, because we adjust to their disappearance so quickly, I mean, I know when I was growing up, people thought the Soviet Union would last forever. Gone in an instant, gone. And with it, other things that seemed more or less permanent. So who knows? Impermanence is the law. Heraclitus was right. You cannot step in the same river twice. Everything changes. And that's why, to return to the few things that are permanent, the tradition and the ability to preserve the tradition is not based on any building or any structure, but rather based on rabbinic teachings, the transmission of the word, the things that can both be preserved and also in some ways changed and adjusted throughout the generations. And that's how they managed to stay. Any other questions before we go out and enjoy the trees? Well, I saw that some of you asked for invitations to Clubhouse. I will go through it and do that sometime today, or have someone do that today, if that's okay. And we'll get you invited. All right. And thank you all for joining us for Thursday Morning Torah, and I look forward to seeing you next week.